There's no such thing as a weedless garden, and it's actually a really good thing because a lot of weeds provide food for wildlife and pollinators. We can use them as food and medicine and in skincare. But there are cases where it's much better to remove weeds than not. I'm Tanya from Lovely Greens, and I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've learned along my gardening path on how to reduce weeds and weeding and have a more bountiful garden. The word weed is becoming a really dirty word these days because we realize that a lot of wild plants have benefits that we didn't see before in the past. So they are food for pollinators and other wildlife, and they're just part of a much broader picture in the environment. But there are some real reasons as to why we want to reduce them in our gardens. Now, they could be outcompeting our crops. They could be a detriment if they got out of our gardens and into the wilds. They could poison livestock in certain situations, so that's the case with ragworts that we have here on the Isle of Man. And they could just be plants that you don't want growing there. So any plant that's growing in the wrong place is a weed. So taking measures to reduce weeds popping up in the first place can save you a whole lot of trouble and a whole lot of effort and help you to have a really bountiful garden. When I first started gardening, I did not use mulch. I didn't see the need for it. I loved the look of freshly turned soil. And I didn't realize that with every bit of soil that I turned over, it basically exposed new seeds, and I was setting myself up for trouble. These days, I always put a good layer of mulch on the top of the soil. And some of my beds are no-dig and others are not. But having that compost on the top stops a lot of the weed seeds from germinating. I still have plenty, like these spurges, but they're manageable. At a glance, the allotment garden looks really controlled and tidy, but there are lots of weeds in there. We're gonna go have a look in a second. But I want to introduce you to my biggest challenge at the moment, and they are these sycamore trees up above. And sycamore, around this time of the year, so autumn, will send out lots of seeds and they drift down onto my plot, and there are tons and tons of little seedlings that pop up in the spring. And I also want to point out that we keep the edges of our allotment relatively wild. So we have nettles and we've got bracken and brambles and all sorts of plants here, and they too make their way onto our plots through seeds. We give pretty good pathways in between, and that helps to reduce them drifting over, but they are still there. So there's no such thing as a weed-free plot here at our allotment. Let's go hunting for some weeds here on the plot, and there are plenty in here. Some of them, like the green alkanet that I planted here deliberately, are still sending up little seedlings. Just have to pull them up, and that's because they have these fleshy roots that just live for ages and then either regrow, or if the root is split, it can actually create more than one plant. There are lots of annual weeds here as well. So these little guys, they will set seed and go all over the place. And you can see that my mulch here is getting quite thin. You can start to see some of the topsoil here, and that's a problem. So mulching is on the agenda very, very soon. My first tip for reducing weeds in the garden is to always mulch, mulch, mulch. And I think with no-dig gardening, very popular these days, people are a little bit confused as to what's no-dig gardening and what's mulching. Now, they can be mutually exclusive. You can still dig your garden and rotivate it, etc. But if you lay a good couple of inches or more of compost or straw or cardboard or whatnot on the surface, that will stop weed seeds from germinating simply because they can't get through. Now, the key element with this is that whatever you use as a mulch needs to be free of weed seeds. I've recently emptied one of the bays of my compost heap, and I'm about to start making some more compost. And I have quite a few materials ready and waiting over here, including grass clippings, and I have some brown materials, so different twigs and sticks and leaves, my old spent sweet peas over there, lots and lots of things. And one thing that I do need to really keep an eye on as I'm building this pile and allowing it to cold compost is to make sure that there's no weed seeds that get into it. Because I just pile things together and it might not necessarily get to the temperatures that will kill off weed seeds, any seeds that make it into my compost could potentially start growing in my beds. If you want to go the full gamut and do no-dig gardening as well, that is an incredible way to reduce weeds, because not only are you using that mulch on the surface, but you're not churning up the soil and bringing old weed seeds to the surface to germinate. I deliberately sowed this little patch of pollinator-friendly flowers, and they've been buzzing with bees all summer. But there are a few plants in here that I did not deliberately plant, including this one, and I believe it's called groundsel. It's a dandelion-looking flower. And you can see they have started to form seed heads. Now, if I leave this be, I'm gonna have so many more of these across my plot, so I'm gonna pull them off. When they were blooming and yellow and different insects were all over them, that's totally fine. But now that they're done, they need to come out. My second tip on reducing weeding is to stop weed seeds from making their way into your garden. And the way you do that is you stop weeds from basically growing seeds and spreading them around. So if you see weed seeds, whether it's an annual that spreads like crazy or a perennial, make sure that you at least nip the seeds off so it doesn't take over. Here at our allotment garden, we have a plant called dock, which I think is pretty common in most of our gardens. And when it sends up a flower stalk, it can literally have hundreds, if not thousands of seeds. And if those disperse, you can have an entirely beautifully cultivated patch of garden that is just pure wall-to-wall dock. And that's the case with a lot of other aggressive wild plants as well. Bindweed is another one. So making sure that you remove those seeds and stop the weeds before they set seed is really, really important. This plot, which is now vacant, is vacant for a reason, and that's because it got an infestation of bindweed, and I mentioned that in my last video. And so we've got it covered, and it's going to be covered till at least next spring to help keep it down. But just over here, there's bindweed growing. But in any case, this is a choking, strangling plant that just vines up everything else and smothers it. And I've had it on my plots as well, and it is a nightmare to get rid of. My third tip for reducing weeds in the garden is simple. It's pathways. In the home garden, I have a pretty expensive pea gravel pathway system around my raised beds. And it keeps weeds from growing in places next to my beds. And also it reduces the amount of time that I spend weeding other places outside of my growing spaces. Now here at the allotment, I use wood chips as well, and they're really effective in their first year to 2 years at keeping the weeds down, because very few plants will like to germinate in fresh wood chips. So that means that I can spend more time dedicated to tending my plants and maybe picking out the weeds that are growing in my beds, rather than spending time weeding the actual walkways. It took me maybe a couple of hours to respread wood chip on my pathways a few weeks ago. And all I did was bring it in here in a wheelbarrow and just throw it down. And it's pretty thick. It's probably 2 or 3 inches thick. And this will suffice in keeping all the weeds down in these walking areas for at least a year, if not 2 years, before the wood chips start breaking down. When the wood chips break down, they become a form of compost and all kinds of things start growing in it again. But until then, I can count on these pathways to be clear and low maintenance, and I can spend a lot more time focusing on growing things in my beds. You know, weeds are really only weeds in the eyes of the beholder, but there are real reasons and cases where we should manage and control wild plants and even certain cultivated plants that move into our gardens on their own. Now, they could be outcompeting our crops and making it more difficult for us to have a yield or to garden in general. They could be a threat to livestock. They could be a threat to native flora and fauna. So, while there are reasons to allow certain plants to colonize our gardens, ones that we can use, there are some real reasons to keep control of the others. So if you have any questions or comments or ideas on how to reduce weeding and better the environment and our gardens at the same time, leave a comment down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time here on Lovely Greens. Bye for now. One last thing before you go, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe to Lovely Greens and click that little bell icon so that you get notifications for when new videos are out.